Good to see you out this morning. I know we have a smaller number than sometimes we do. The church is sometimes compared to Noah's Ark, I guess, compared to a boat. I'm afraid if we were a boat this morning, we'd probably capsize over to this back corner over here. So we got a lot more over there than elsewhere. So I wanted to mention Wednesday night we had our first little singing night. Enjoyed it thoroughly. We not only sang some songs, but we talked about the music of the way the songs were written, and we talked about the memories of some of those songs. I think we got up to about page 12 or 13 in the book, but we had a good time singing and talking about the songs and thinking about what they meant to us, and we tried a couple that we weren't very familiar with, but that was fun too. It's what it was all about. So we'll be doing that again the first Wednesday night in December. So we'll be doing that every first Wednesday night. So if you're able to make it for that, and we may even, I've got, I know I have a few slides on the announcements PowerPoint. Sometimes I'll have a slide on there that has a word from a song, and it's like a multiple choice question of what they mean. We may do some things like that too on those Wednesday nights. Where singing for a whole hour, you wear your voice out, but if you take a little break in between the songs and have a chance to kind of rest the voice a minute between the songs. So we may do some of those kind of things. Or one of the things we talked about was the stories behind some of the songs, the people that wrote those songs. And we've got a book that has some of those stories of the writers of the songs and things. So we may share one of those during the night as well. Try to have it be an enjoyable time, as well as learning new songs, remembering some of those old songs, and having the chance to sing them together on that Wednesday night. Maybe at some point we may, if it keeps going well, maybe we'll switch it over to the second class on Sunday one Sunday a month or something after our worship, and have a time of singing and things then too. I know Wednesday nights after dark, some can't get out after dark on Wednesday nights. I'm understanding that more and more the older I get, the harder it is to see at night. Perfectly proper present presenting. Last week we looked at the first installment of this 4-part series, and today we're going to continue that. We're going to look at the second 5 items. And as with the first 5, all of these will also begin with a P. Let's review some things quickly. So it says, this was actually something Winston Churchill said: we make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give. Giving is an important part of life. We've got to be able to not just make a living with the things we get, the money we earn, but also make a life out of the things that we give. One of the things that Robert Louis Stevenson said was, you can give without loving, but you can never love without giving. If we love the Lord, we're going to give. And I know a lot of times when we say give, everybody thinks money, thinking about the collection that we just took up a few minutes ago. But there's a lot more that we give when we give to the Lord than just the money. We need to give Him our allegiance. We need to give Him of our time. We need to give Him of our abilities. We need to give Him ourselves. We give ourselves to Him. So So there's so much involved. It's not just about dollars and cents. Stewardship. I remember the first time that I was going to teach a class on stewardship, and I thought, well, that'll only be like 1 or 2 weeks. There won't be much to say. And I got a book. It was written by a brother from a church up in Nashville. And that book, it was 13-week lesson book on stewardship. And I thought, oh, he's going to be saying the same thing over and over every week for 13 weeks. And then I read the book. It was a book that had been recommended. Oh, this is a really good book on stewardship for classes. And I started studying that book, and he brought out ideas. I thought, I never thought about that in regards to stewardship, about what we do with our time, what we do with our abilities, what we do with our attitudes. We talked about that some last week as well. And of course, the money plays a role in there. But there's a lot more to our stewardship and a lot more to our giving to God than just the money. But that is the thing we often focus on the most. Well, certainly that's not surprising. Jesus focused on money a lot. He speaks about money more often in the New Testament than just about every other topic. There are maybe 2 or 3 topics that he talks about more than he talks about money, because he knows that money is going to be the downfall of a lot of people, and the way that they love money and serve money instead of serving God, it's going to be a problem. So he talked about it a lot. He talked about covetousness and the things associated with that. As we consider this morning, Acts chapter 20, verses 33 through 35, Paul, speaking of his travels around throughout the cities with the churches, he said, I coveted no one's silver or gold apparel. You yourselves know that these hands ministered to my necessities and to those who were with me. In all things I have shown you that by working hard in this way, we must help the weak and remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. That's a hard one for us sometimes to really get a hold of, because a lot of times we really like the receiving side of things. But Jesus said the blessings, the better blessings. He didn't say that it's not a blessing to receive, but he said it's more blessed. There are better blessings. It's more of a blessing to give. Part of the blessing with giving is that you're able to give. Sometimes when you're receiving, it's because you're not able to give. So part of the blessing of giving is the ability to do so. The fact that you have enough to share that with somebody else is a blessing in and of itself. And then, of course, the ability, not only the ability, but actually following through and sharing that with someone else. In that book, he also talked about our stewardship of the gospel. Sharing, it's not always about, sometimes it is about sharing some food with somebody who's hungry, sharing some clothing, sharing some time, sharing some money, a listening ear when they need it. But sometimes it's about sharing the gospel with those who need it, and everyone needs that. Sharing the gospel is a form of stewardship to us as well. So last week we talked about the fact that pleasing God with our giving, having proper present presenting is possible. It's practical. He doesn't ask us for something that is impractical. And it's interesting, even under the Old Testament law, I was just talking with one of my coworkers yesterday about this because of a question he had about something that came up about Jesus flipping over tables, and I explained the story to him. But we talked about, even in the Old Testament law, it would have been impractical when they had to come and bring their sacrifice to the temple and have it sacrificed in Jerusalem. Can you imagine if you lived 100 miles away from Jerusalem and you needed to sacrifice a sheep? Can you imagine dragging that sheep with you? Now remember, they didn't have cars and trucks and trailers and things like that. They walked maybe rode on a donkey or something like that. Can you imagine dragging that sheep 100 miles to get it to Jerusalem so you could sacrifice it? That would be very impractical. So you know what God did? In the law, he gave them the provision with these situations where they could just take money, they could sell items, take the money that they made from selling the items, carry that in their little pouch, bring that to Jerusalem, and then when they got to Jerusalem, to that area, then they could buy a sheep or a goat or whatever to sacrifice. It's much more practical for them. See, God never asks us to do things that are just ridiculous and impractical. He's always got reasoning behind what he tells us to do. Then we talked about it being pleasing and the cheerful attitude with which we do it. The proper mindset is important. We talked about it being profuse, abundant. We can never give God too much. We talked about in class this morning. And then we talked about it being properly pointed. That it needs to be going in the right direction and for the right reason. And we talked about some of the wrong motivations for giving. And of course, the right motivation for giving is a love of God and a desire to give back to him what we have that he has so richly blessed us with. And so all those things we looked at last week. This week we want to begin with our sixth point, paradoxical. Of course, a paradox is something that sounds like a contradiction. It sounds like it's an opposite, but it actually isn't. Well, the verse that we just read in Acts chapter 20, where Jesus said, "It is more blessed to give than to receive," is one of those paradoxes. It doesn't seem like that would be that way. We might be tempted to think that, no, getting is better, because then I have more. If I give, then I have less, and more is better than less. And yet, Jesus says, no, the way people think it works is not the way it really works. And some of us have probably experienced that. We've probably given and had that blessing from giving and realized, you know what, that was better than getting. Again, not to say that it's not a blessing to receive. Sometimes we need to receive things, and it is a blessing when people love us and care about us enough to give us what we need, and that we can receive that. But oh, what a blessing it is to help somebody else when they have a need, to be able to fulfill that. In this same this same idea of paradoxes, Luke chapter 6 and verse 38, Jesus says, "Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down and shaken together, and running over, shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that you mete it out, it shall be measured to you again." So you measure it out one little grain at a time, then that's what you're going to get back. He said, if you give, and you give cheerfully and willingly, you're going to get back more than you gave. Again, that doesn't sound like it makes sense. But think about the law of harvest. When you plant, you grow plants. Those plants produce more than what was planted. You take a kernel of corn. You plant that kernel of corn. If you only got back one kernel of corn from that, you'd be in trouble, wouldn't you? Now, it's true sometimes, crops do get destroyed and you don't get anything back. But really, most of the time, even when they talk about crops getting destroyed, they usually did get back as much as they put in. It's just they needed to get a lot more to have enough for the seed for the next year and so forth. At least before, nowadays with the genetically modified things and everything, it maybe is a little different than the old time way of doing things. But when we plant a kernel of corn, we're expecting to get 1,000 back, hundreds at least. And so we can save some to plant the next time. And of course, we don't, you ever just plant one kernel of corn, well, that kernel might not produce. Jesus talked about the fact that some of the seed sprang up and then withered away in the hot sun. Some of the seed was plucked away by the birds. So if you only plant one, you might not get any. But if you plant a whole row or a whole field or acres, then you start to see the multiplication effect. Because even though some of those seeds won't come up and some of those plants will die, you'll wind up with so much more than you started with. And it's the way giving works. One of the reasons that people are confused sometimes, they think, well, if I give, I'll have less. No. God says it works just like planting that seed. If you had a bag of corn and you said, well, if I plant it, I won't have any. Well, that's true. You won't have any for a while because it's going to take time for it to grow. So if I give, I won't have what I gave. Well, that's true. For a while, you won't have that. But Jesus promises that if you give, now, this is not to be taken as like some sort of investment strategy. Well, I'll just give all my money away and then I'll get twice as much back. That's not what he's talking about. It's not a greedy, covetous kind of thing where I'll give so I get it back. He's just saying it's the nature thing. If we give lovingly and cheerfully and out of a good heart, he promises we're going to get more than we gave. It'll be a good thing for us. And so we see that one. In Malachi chapter 3 and verse 10, God says the same thing about our giving to the Lord. To those under the old law, of course, they had the tithe, which was, by definition, 10% of their increase. It wasn't 10% of everything they had. It was 10% of the increase they made during that time period. God didn't believe on retaxing them for things they already had. Only the increase was what he expected the tithe from. But that 10%. So he says to them, and this was after they weren't doing what they were supposed to. They weren't giving like they were supposed to. He says, bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house, and test me now, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open up the windows of heaven to you and pour out a blessing to you, that there will not be room enough to receive it. God said to the children, see, they were, well, if we give it to God, then we won't have it. We won't have enough if we give God what he wants. God said, tell you what, you test me and see. You give me what's mine, what I've told you to give me, and you see if I don't pour out so much you can't handle it. I'll give you more than you got room for. He promised. He's going to make it work out right. Now, sometimes the only thing you can save is what you give. Baylor University started out, I believe it was a Baptist college originally. The man who gave money for building that school later lost his business, he lost his property, he went bankrupt. And somebody asked him, don't you wish you had the money back that you gave to build that school? And he said, no, not at all. That's all I saved. If he'd have had that money, he'd have lost it too. But because he'd already given it to the school, he had the legacy, at least, of that school, even though he had gone bankrupt. So if I had kept that money, I would have lost it too. I am thankful that I gave that building to that school when I did, for the building of that school. If we give it when we've got it, we won't lose it. Something for us to think about. The paradoxes of giving, and giving is paradoxical. The seventh thing we want to notice is that giving is personal. It's an individual thing. It's for you and me and you and him and her and each of us individually. It's very personal. In Luke chapter 11 and verse 41, he says, "But rather give alms of such things as you have, and behold, all things are clean unto you." Give what you've got. Give what matters to you, what's personal to you. They say that's one of the problems with the idea of socialism is you run out of other people's money to give away. You see, our giving is not supposed to be giving other people's money or other people's time. We can't volunteer somebody else to do that. It's personal. It's what am I going to give? What can I give? And I may not be able to give the same thing you can give, and you may not be able to give the same thing I can give. We are different people, and it's very personal to us what we give. A story is told of a man who had been laid off from his job, and when Christmas time rolled around, he gave his wife a dishwasher for Christmas. As you have to understand the magnitude of that gift. Because first you think, well, wait, he couldn't afford that. Well, the house was old, and the wiring and the plumbing couldn't handle a mechanical dishwasher. There wasn't even room for it in the small kitchen. And they'd been struggling even to pay the interest on the mortgage. But he hated washing dishes. So he would rather do anything else besides washing dishes. His wife, the mother of the family, had gone through a major surgery. And it was difficult for her to do anything that required her to use her arms even. Well, Christmas came. No large box appeared. No new plumbing, no new wiring was installed. No remodeling of the kitchen occurred. But there was a small note on the branch of the Christmas tree, handwritten by the father. For 1 year, I will wash every dirty dish in this household. Every one. And he did. He really did. For an entire year, the man who hated washing, and I can feel I hate washing dishes too. But for 1 year, he washed every dirty dish. That's a personal gift. And that's a sacrificial gift because he didn't want to do that. But he knew it needed to be done, and he knew they couldn't afford an actual dishwasher. What a gift. The eighth thing, I forgot to skip to that. The eighth thing that we want to realize is that perfectly proper present presenting is private. It's not our responsibility to check and see what everybody else is giving. It's a private matter. In Matthew chapter 6 and verses 2 and through 4, Jesus said there in the Sermon on the Mount, "Therefore, when you do your giving, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may have the glory of men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do your giving, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your giving may be in secret, and that your Father, which sees in secret, may reward you openly." Now, obviously, Jesus is using a bit of hyperbole. It's kind of impossible for your left hand not to know what your right hand's doing. It doesn't seem very realistic, right? But he's exaggerating to make the point. You are doing it privately, almost secretly even. Well, you're certainly not bragging about, well, look how much I wrote my check for. Everybody see this? I've seen that. You ever see that I remember it was after Hurricane Katrina. Lived down not too far from there at the time. In fact, it came through down there in Alabama where we lived when it came through. And during that time after that hurricane, there were famous people, athletes, actors and actresses, and various wealthy people would go down there, and they'd have a camera crew, and they'd be holding, those big giant checks like Publishers Clearinghouse. They'd be holding this big giant check, for $200,000 or whatever. I'm giving this money to the victims of the hurricane, blah, blah, blah. I wonder how much of that money ever actually got to the hurricane victims, and how much of it was just them wanting to get in front of the cameras and brag about themselves. And, I hear stories sometimes about some of these famous people who are doing good things with their money. They are giving back to their communities in some way, but that aren't having big press conferences to brag about it. And I think about this passage. I think Jesus just give. Don't make a show out of it. Just do it. It's a private thing. Nobody else is going to be checking up on you to see if you get, nobody's going to look at well, here's your income, and you only gave this much. You should have been given this much. I guess in some cult somebody probably is doing that, but God never called on us to check everybody else's gift. He told us to give as we should, give as we've prospered, give as we've purposed in our heart, not as according to how everybody else thinks we should, or to tell everybody else how they ought to give. We're supposed to give in the proper way ourselves. It's a private thing. The story is told of the preacher who's, as this beautiful Sunday, as the collection basket is passed, recall the words of the Bible, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And as the plates are passed, and one drops his money in, and the fellow sitting next to him says, "Hey, buddy, how come you always smile when you're giving to God, but you don't when it's tax time and you have to give to Caesar?" He said, "God doesn't audit." Well, that may be true. There will be an auditing at the end of time, though. God will call us to answer for what we've done, but that's between us and Him for now. We're not checking up on each other. I just noticed in that story, it said Mike, and I left that out. But the guy in the story's name was Mike. So it's a private matter between us and God. However, it is also a public matter. The presenting of our gifts, our presents to God, is publicly done. When we consider 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, he says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by in store as God has prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come." And we think about the stories in Acts 4 of those that were giving. They were coming and they were bringing their gifts and giving them right there to the apostles in front of everybody. It wasn't that they were trying to brag, but it just, that's the way it was done. And just like, we pass the collection plate in the public assembly. It's publicly done. And that's okay. That it's both private, but also public. Another one of those paradoxes of a sort. Story is told of a church that decided to go back in time one Sunday. And they patterned one Sunday service after those in the colonial days. Back in the colonial, I remember, up in Tennessee, one of the first buildings that was used by a Church of Christ up there still has in the back, like where we've got the double doors, they actually had a door on one side and a door on the other side. The men and the women didn't even walk in the same door. And then the women sat on one side and all the men sat on the other side. It was an odd thing the way they used to do those things instead of the way we do. We let people just sit wherever they want to. And sometimes couples even sit next to each other and things. But this one occasion they were trying to do it like the old-fashioned times. So they came, and of course they were all dressed in their old-timey clothes, and the men are all sitting on one side, and the women are all sitting on the other side. And when it came time for the collection, they announced, okay, this is going to be done in the old-time way, and what we're going to do is we're going to ask the head of each household to come forward and place the money here in the collection basket. So the men instantly rose, and then a lot of them went over across the aisle to their wives to get the money so they could come up and give it. And what an amusement that was to everybody that they had to do that. They weren't prepared for that part of it, I guess. But when we think about it, is public, and because of that, other people are going to see us giving. And I know sometimes there are going to be nosy people that are going because it was public. I know some of us are on a fixed income of one kind or another. Some people get paid monthly. And so they give it all that Sunday after they get their money. Other people divide it up and give some each Sunday. But I remember somebody going, well, so-and-so, they didn't give anything last week or this week. Well, you don't know how they give. But because it's public, they say, well, they didn't put anything in the plate when it went by. That's not our responsibility to make sure everybody's putting something in the plate. But again, maybe somebody they get their Social Security or the retirement or whatever by the month, and that's when they give it. The Bible says, give as you've prospered. So that's when they prospered, that's when they give. Other people take that and they just divide it up and give some each Sunday. It doesn't matter. The point is that we're giving. But like I said, some people are going to, because it is public, they're going to make a big deal out of it. Keep forgetting that I've got those lines on those other slides for the final thing we want to consider this morning is that our giving is to be profound. The word profound has a few different meanings, but mainly the one we're looking at here is one that means with great meaning or intensity. Our giving is to have great meaning and intensity to it. There's a lot involved. In Malachi chapter 3 and verses 8 and 9, God says, remember we already looked at Malachi 3 a little bit ago in verse 10. This is the couple verses before that, before he gets to that promise that he'll open the windows of heaven and pour it out on them. But first he has to berate them a little. He says, will a man rob God? That's, thieves will thieve from just about anybody, but would you rob God? And he says, yet you have robbed me. But you say, how have we robbed you? He said, in tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even the whole nation. Don't rob God. There are profound consequences that come with giving properly, but there are profound consequences that also come from stingy giving or improper giving because of the wrong attitudes. Robbing God. Cheating him out of what is his. But there can be profound blessings if we'll give as we should. Of course, there's nothing, we talk about, there's nothing in the New Testament that says, nails down that 10% tithe like they had in the Old Testament. But it's not a bad place to start, to consider what is the salvation of your soul worth to you? What is the abundance of blessing that God has poured into our lives? The fact that we have the gospel, the fact that we have the avenue of prayer available to us, the fact that He's poured out love and mercy and grace and the kindness and joy and peace in our hearts, and all of those blessings that He's blessed us with. And we studied Ephesians a few weeks ago. We're blessed with all spiritual blessings in heavenly places in Christ Jesus. What's that worth? Can we even put a dollar amount on that? We can't. Could we put a percent? And we realize He owns it all anyway. Everything we have is His. We're His. The story is told of a church whose treasurer resigned. The church asked, it was a farming community, the church asked the local grain elevator to manager to take that position of church treasurer. He said, I'll do it on 2 conditions. 1, I won't give a treasurer's report for the first year. And 2, nobody asks any questions about the finances the first year. Now that's a little sketchy kind of sounding that. But they all trust him. They asked him. He wasn't volunteering. They were trying to get him to do it. And he said, these are the 2 conditions. So they said, okay. They agreed. They trusted him. They did business with him anyway. They brought their grain to the grain elevator and everything anyway, so they trusted him. At the end of the year, he gave his report. All of the church's debts, $200,000 plus, had been paid. The minister's salary had been increased 8%. Missionaries and other giving has been up 200%. They're given 2 times as much as they had been. There were no outstanding bills, and they had over $11,000 sitting in the bank. That's quite a turnaround in 1 year. They were shocked. They said, how did you do that? Where did that money come from? We've been struggling just to get the bills paid for the past 5 years. He said, well, since most of you bring your grain to my elevator throughout the year, I simply took that 10% for God. When He brought it in, you probably never even noticed it was missing. And then I used that. Imagine what we could do for the Lord if we gave. You know, the studies and different statistical analysis have showed that on average, most churches give, as a group, give 2 to 3% of their income. If churches are doing as much as they're doing with 2 to 3%, imagine what they could do with 10%. Imagine what could be accomplished if all the people in all the churches were giving. Now that's across the board. And some denominations have little higher or lower percentages, but kind of across the board, it's somewhere around 2 to 3%. Some are up as high as 5%. Now that's not to say that there aren't people in those churches that are giving even more, maybe giving 15, 20%. But there's some that's sitting there not giving anything too. So the average, it's the way averages work. But think about how profound it would be, what we could do for the Lord. And when He promises too, that if we'll give, He'll open up the windows of heaven and pour out, so we'll have so much abundance we won't have room for it all. And then guess what we could do? We could give even more. It's, sometimes there's a vicious cycle that's a downward spiral. Well, this is a wonderful spiral that's an upward spiral. It's a wonderful thing. If we give, He'll give us more to give. And we can give more, and then He'll give us even more. He will bless us if we bless Him. Maybe you're here this morning and haven't given as you should. Maybe you haven't had the proper attitudes. Maybe you gave, but you grumbled and complained about it. Maybe you've given of your money, but you haven't given of your allegiance and of your time and of other things. If God can do what he does with an hour a week, what could he do if you gave him 2 or 3? What if you gave him an hour a day? Imagine what he could do with that. What if you gave him your whole life, all day, every day? What could he do then? If you're here and you have a need to respond to God's invitation, please do as we stand and sing the invitation song.
What can wash away my sin?
Nothing but